with us today John Riley, co-director emeritus of the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for maybe some Germans who might not know, joint program on the science and policy of global change. And finally, we have Manuel Carmona Yebra. He's a counselor for environment and oceans at the delegation of the European Union to the United States. So thank you very much for joining us today. We look very much forward to hearing your insights and, of course, having you engage with the audience at the end here in our Q&A session. So without further ado, our first presenter is going to be John. Are you ready to go, John?
Yes, I am. Muted myself, and now I am.
Okay, I'll pass it over to you, and I'll put myself on mute here.
Sorry about that. I have a whole bunch of stuff open here, I guess. Okay, so I appreciate the chance to talk to you all today. We did a paper that appeared earlier this year in Humanities and Social Science Communications, speculating on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on GHG emissions. I guess I have impact there twice, sorry. So a little background, our program has a large model of the entire Earth system, including atmosphere, oceans, terrestrial vegetation, but also the world economy. And so we make projections of where the world is heading from time to time, and what policies might be effective or not effective, and what sort of technologies might be involved in the solution to climate change. So in being in this projection business, the pandemic, of course, had a large impact on the economy. And I think many people said, oh, look, this has massively changed how we work, and maybe will that continue or not. So being in the projection business, whether we thought it was important or not, or what the impact is, we really had to kind of give some thought to what this meant for, what the pandemic meant for global GHG emissions going forward. Was it going to really change the situation we had projected earlier, and how and what might the effects would be? So that's a little background on this. Of course, projecting the future of the world economy and the US economy and European economy is, under the best of circumstances, highly uncertain. And looking at the impact of the pandemic, even more uncertain, because we're really looking at unprecedented effects. So we had taken some work, very short-term work done by the U.S. government, in the Congressional Budget Office, looking at the short-term impacts on the U.S., and also considered some of the work the World Bank and others had done, looking at the global economy and how the economy would be affected by the pandemic, and then how it might recover. So we basically just tried to extend that, imagining, looking, and the main effect we saw was, of course, a large drop in employment, both an increase in unemployment, but then and ultimately then a reduction in the employment rate, as many people stopped looking even for work or going out to work. So we estimated that effect on the economy. So that was our primary effect. Let's see, how do I move this forward there? So, what we found, here's a quick figure. We had global GDP gradually recovering, and employment rates slowly returned to pandemic level. We estimated some increasing impacts by extrapolating this original Congressional Budget Office work, seeing that the reduction in employment rates might last as long as 10 years. So we're still having less employment out in 2030 than we would have had we not had the pandemic and the projection we make. Of course, this is highly uncertain, depends on lots of things. But I think if we look back at even the financial crisis, while unemployment dropped soon after, we did see this phenomenon that the employment rate, that a lot of people left the workforce and really didn't come back. So there are some long run effects, but not dramatic, not huge effects. Even though the economy is recovering, we're going back towards full employment, because the employment rate stays lower, the economy is a little bit lower. So that obviously, global GHG emissions, or GHG emissions in an economy like the US or Europe or anywhere in the world, economic activity is a big source of GHG emissions. So we estimated then what the impact would be on GHG emissions. And you see here, the blue bars, GHG emissions with the pandemic, and without the pandemic factored in, this employment effect, you see that we had slightly higher emissions. Now, one of the reasons we factored in the idea that even without the pandemic, countries had made their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, under the Paris Agreement, and we assumed that they would be meeting those. So one of the things that leads to not much impact of the pandemic on emissions is that the impact on emissions was not enough to reduce emissions below what the country's promised NDC was. So as a result, one of the effects of the pandemic was to reduce the effort needed to meet the NDC. So that didn't have any change in emissions, but if you thought there was going to be a carbon price of $50 to meet the NDC, maybe now it was only $40. So we weren't seeing really big effects on emissions, but there is some. So important to factor that in. So, and here I just have the slide saying in Europe and the US, other developed countries, the emissions in 2030 with the pandemic remain above commitments under their Paris NDC. So there's no impact on the emissions, just easier to meet those NDCs. But that was just looking at the simple impact of GDP on GDP levels on emissions. There was a concern that deeper structural changes in the economy might have a big effect. Now we're all used to, instead of traveling to meetings, having Zoom meetings, or instead of going into work, working remotely. Was that going to massively change? Might that massively change emissions? And there, we didn't really come up with any, we didn't really integrate any of that into our model because it was so speculative, but we did come up with this chart that kind of suggested what we thought some of the structural changes might be. So might there be changes in retailing, restaurants, entertainment, banking, services? Well, there, the plus we indicated, yeah, maybe we'll do less of that, or there will be more done virtually. So that might then reduce emissions further. But based on our modeling activity, the service sector only accounts for 2.5% of all emissions. So even if you had a significant change in that, it's not going to have a great change in global emissions. Maybe, and really, I don't think if the pandemic, we finally solve the pandemic, whether there'll continue to be long-term changes in these activities is unclear. Certainly some things like maybe banking and services has been moving remotely, virtually anyway. But, if you imagined a 10% reduction in these, that might be a big deal. And then 10% of 2.5% is, a very small reduction in overall emissions. And then remote work and reduced commuting, that may be a phenomenon that we see. And so that might then also contribute to a further reduction in emissions. But if we look at private vehicles, they're only 6.5% of all emissions globally. So again, even we're not going to eliminate going to work completely. And I think as we see people wanting to go back and needing to get back together, there are benefits of actually being in the same room. So we're not going to eliminate that completely. But I know at least on the MIT campus, there have been some long-term changes where now even as people have gone, we're back on campus full time, although I'm retired. We've made a decision that people only need to come in a couple of days a week if they'd rather work from home. So there is some impact there, but that of course isn't going to be true for all businesses. And then maybe less air travel. We're just discussing in the breakout room. One of the people said they're in the airport now, ready to go back to travel. So yes, maybe we'll do more commuting, but again, air travel is only 3% of all emissions. And then will there be changes in public transport, freight, delivery? Well, here we said that could be plus or minus. If people are afraid to use public transport because they don't want to be in crowded spaces, that may push them more into private vehicles and increase emissions. If we're doing a lot of virtual e-commerce, products still have to be delivered, so maybe that might increase emissions. So I think it's up in the air whether that would be plus or minus. Then, another hypothesized effect, in the United States and also in Europe, we had fairly large fiscal stimulus, an attempt and money, federal government deficits to try and blunt the effect of the pandemic. But ultimately, that means a larger deficit, and at some point, the need to close that deficit, which then might have a slightly negative effect on the economic activity in the longer run. Even though it's very necessary to stimulate the economy in the short run, it's an expense which we aren't covering at the moment. So that might have some reduction in GDP in the longer run. So we estimated that an additional, given the deficit spending that had been like at the order of $3 trillion globally, we estimated that that might have a 0.7 of a reduction in GDP over a decade, reducing emissions growth by maybe 0.5 to 0.6% over the period. So our conclusion was, well, yes, there's some effect here, but in fact, they're small. So what we then concluded, what may be more important is, so ultimately we still need policy. And so the question is, is the pandemic going to intensify our efforts to fight climate change through policy intervention, or might it reduce it? I guess we saw as very good news that in the midst of the pandemic, Europe announced a goal of net zero by 2050 and increased their goal for 2030. And China came out saying they were going to be net zero by 2060. So those two regions are 35% of global emissions. So if they actually achieve those ambitions and get to net zero, that's a bigger effect than all these other things combined, as you can see. And other countries are 65% emissions. What might they do? We had left a question mark there. As you know now, with our new administration in the US, the Biden administration is committed to get to net zero by 2050 and has offered a target of, I think, 52% by 2030. So that's adding on to this effect. Whether that's due to the pandemic or partly due to the pandemic or independent of it is, I think, a big question. But at least you might have hypothesized that all of a sudden the fall in GDP might cause people to say, "Wait, we've now become poorer. Can we afford to also fight climate change?" But it appears that hasn't been the case. So that was our conclusions. And with that, I'm going to end my talk, and I'm happy to pass the baton on to the next speaker and look forward to your questions and thoughts on this. We're always interested in what other people are thinking about it. This, of course, is just a lot of judgment and speculation, but it's good to hear what other people are thinking on these topics. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John, so much for your presentation. If people have questions, of course, all of our presenters will be available for the interactive Q&A at the end. So we'll be moving on to our next presenter, Howard Lerner. Are you ready to go, Howard?
Yes, I am. And
okay.
Hopefully my screen share is working here. And
I see it. If you want to put it maybe in presentation mode, but it's up on my screen.
All righty. I'm going to take a little bit different take than John, and hopefully it's quite complimentary. And the punchline here is that while COVID has been happening, Mother Nature hasn't taken a pause. Climate change is happening. Policy is happening. Clean energy development is happening. And investment is happening, right? That's not to denigrate the impacts of COVID, which have been devastating. But climate change hasn't ceased. It hasn't taken a pause, and there are a lot of other things going on. So let's take a look. First of all, just a quick slide. This is where we were going into 2020. Over the past decade, in the Midwest, coal plant usage has gone down, energy efficiency has taken hold, and demand has been flat, in some cases declining.
Sorry to stop you there, Howard. Your slide did not progress. I'm still seeing your first one. So if you're talking about what I see maybe on the side here, if you could make that larger.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to here ask Elena to take over the slide function, if you don't mind.
That would be great. Then you could just focus on your remarks and we can do the steering for you.
That would be terrific. Okay.
Yeah, sorry to have interrupted you mid-thought, but it looked like you were referring to the chart on the next slide.
Not a problem at all.
Yes, let me get the slides up and I will begin presenting. Perfect.
All righty. Thank you, Elena.
Yeah, no problem.
Slide 2, just where we're at. What's been happening in the Midwest and nationally in many ways in the United States is that coal, that's black on this chart, coal production and utilization and generation is going down. Nuclear has stayed relatively constant, that's the red. Natural gas, the yellow, going up. And renewables, the green, up as well. Just sort of a shot in time where we've been, the pattern over the past decade. And Elena, if you can go to the next slide. So as said, nature didn't take a pause. COVID-19 has been a distraction, obviously, from a perspective of global climate change and the world focusing on it. But climate change problems are getting worse. They haven't paused. And it's more real and people understand it. People are seeing the extreme weather events, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the wildfires. Here in the Midwest, the changing levels of Lake Michigan, the other Great Lakes. It's becoming much more real to people as they're seeing, you know, in a very vivid graphic way, what's happening with climate change during the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's go to the next slide, if you could, Elena. At the same time, over the past year, there's been a tremendous change, as we all know, in the federal government. President Biden has stepped up. He says the federal government is all in for climate change solutions. And that's a radical departure and a 179-degree shift, as we all know from where the Trump administration was. Government sends signals to the marketplace, and a lot will be tied into the fate of what happens with the Build Back Better, which is now in the reconciliation process in Congress, the president's proposal, and the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the IIJA, that's also enmeshed in congressional politics. But investors are proceeding as if the federal government and many states are all in, that it will work out, that climate change is now a priority when it comes to federal and state government action, and states are indeed stepping up. We're watching the state of Illinois pass comprehensive climate and energy legislation. 5 Midwest states have come together on EV infrastructure. The Northeast Compact on EVs is moving forward. So lots of action among lots of the states. We could probably do a whole separate presentation on what each of the states are doing, but collectively it's a lot, and it's aligned with where the federal government is going. And even if the economic budget reconciliation legislation or the infrastructure legislation are pared down in the congressional negotiations, keep in mind the tremendous powers of the executive. And the federal government at the executive branch level is truly acting in a way that it's all in for climate change solutions. And it's doing that in the midst of the pandemic. Let's go on to the next slide. So as the technology improves, there's more money. And as many of you know, when it comes to solar plus storage, the technology is getting better, more efficient. Solar plus storage is market clearing. It addresses peak, while wind runs more or less 70% at night. So it tends to be more off peak. Solar plus storage can be a 24/7 resource. And that's where all the market, all the money, utilities and others are going. There has been a COVID, if you will, created uptick in the price of PV panels. We're looking at, because of supply chain issues, the panel prices, which have dropped for years, actually going up a little bit. But still, solar plus storage is very price competitive. And all the recent studies, Wood Mackenzie, the work being done by Innovation, the analysis that will to be seen by Lazar, that's coming out soon each year. It comes out around the end of October. Solar plus storage is moving forward economically and in the market. Policies drive markets. And as investors are seeing what's going on in Washington and the states, and the technology is improving, money is sluicing through the system. And this is private equity money chasing all sorts of things, clean energy. It's Bill Gates, it's venture capitalists, and you're seeing it driven in part by ESG investing. The huge pouring of philanthropic foundation investments, government investments, private investments into ESG funds has meant that the Fidelities, the Schwabs, the Vanguards, the BlackRocks are all looking for investments that fit ESG. And that's helping provide a tremendous financial push for more clean energy investments of different types. And as we know, ironically, but in a real world, it's been happening during the pandemic. The stock market in the United States has been growing in terms of price going up, S&P 500's going up, all those financial indicators are going up, which means you have more investment assets that are out there being deployed, and they're moving increasingly in the clean energy direction and climate change solutions overall. The ESG piece is driving a lot of that. Let's move on to the next one. So this is just a couple of slides and graphs, and I'm sorry that my arts and crafts skills are not as good as they might be on the screenshot. But simply put, the dark blue is solar. This is a graph from Wood Mackenzie. The lighter blue is wind. And so what you're seeing is over the last few years, almost all of the new investment going in is solar and it's wind. I mean, that's where the new generation is. There's a little bit of natural gas going in, but overwhelmingly in the United States, the new generation going in 2020, the numbers are 82%. 2021 first half, 93% of the new generation is solar and wind. That's where it's all moving. Let's move on to the next slide. Different piece here. This is from NREL. Says pretty much the same thing as the Wood Mackenzie slide. All the new generation coming in, it's solar, both utility scale and distributed solar and wind. Some natural gas coming in, nothing else. There's no new coal. There's no new nuclear coming into the system. The only new nuclear plant coming in is the Vogtle plant in Georgia. And as I think everybody knows, that's been mired in cost overruns and political battling and controversy. The price tag has grown enormously, and it makes it a very, very difficult case to argue that new nuclear, at least of that design, is anywhere remotely close to being economical in the market. So everything coming in, for the most part, 80, 90%, this year 90%, is solar and wind. Let's go to the next slide. This is the path of solar growth. And we've seen this before. As I'll show you in a subsequent slide, it's the path of wind development. It's the path of digital cameras. It's the path of cell phones. It's the path of so much new technology development in the United States. If you look at what happened in the conversion from landline to cell phones, and what we're seeing is the electricity sector is transforming as radically as the telecommunications system did, as wireless technologies moved us from landlines to cell phones. You have the early adopters at the beginning, and you have some modest growth. And then after the modest growth, boom, it just takes off. So that's what we're seeing right now with solar. And if you give me just 1 second here, we're going to deal with a little bit of the solar effect of the sun coming in from my side window. And hopefully that will be a little bit better, folks. Okay. So let's keep looking at the slides and move forward, if you would, please, Elena. And this is the wind path. Same as we've seen in the solar path. It just started happening about 10 years earlier. Wind took off, initial growth at the beginning, a little bit, boom. By the time we got to the early 2010s, it began to take off in a big way. So that's what we're seeing with solar. We know that growth curve, and that's what we're seeing with storage. We know that growth curve. And all of this is happening as the technology improves, as policies point in that direction, and as investment capital is flowing in very robust ways, even though we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So if you move on one more slide, Elena, just what this means for jobs. So in Illinois, for example, we did a study of the businesses involved in solar, wind, and geothermal. When you put it all together, and some of the businesses do both, there are about 450 businesses just in one state, Illinois, that are in the clean energy sector. These are businesses that are everything from doing manufacturing to installations to substantial, financing services and so forth. So good for jobs, good for economic growth, good for the environment, creating a lot of business. But all this activity is moving forward. As policies moving forward, technology improvements are moving forward, capital and investment money is moving forward in the midst of COVID. So Mother Nature hasn't taken a pause. Climate change is happening, and people are seeing the impacts of destruction and extreme weather events being even more substantial. The wildfires that we all watched on TV, the horrifying wildfires this summer and the flooding. At the same time, COVID's happening, but we're seeing, at least in the clean energy sector and in the electric vehicle sector, a tremendous amount of progress that seems to be going forward despite what's happening with the pandemic. So hopefully that's a little bit of an optimistic look on the solution side while we're dealing with the very real problems of climate change going forward. Let's move to Q&A or after the next presentation. I look forward to talking more with everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation and focusing some on the positives. And we're moving at least slowly but surely in the right direction. So looking forward.
You've got to be an optimist. What's
Absolutely.
the point of not trying to figure out how to solve problems?
Great. So Manuel, are you ready to begin with your presentation? Start our final presentation here of the day.
Hello, Justin. Hello, everybody. I'm getting there.
Wonderful. Yes, it just pulled up.
Okay, that's good. Let me just try to put it a bit bigger. There you go. Well, good morning here from Washington, D.C. My name is Manuel Carmona, and I just arrived 1 month ago to the EU delegation to the United States to cover environment and oceans. And I was listening to the presentations before by Howard and John, and this sounds really very much in line with what the EU has been doing, basically not stopping during the pandemic, coming up with policy. John was referring to it, and this is indeed the case. In my presentation, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what the European Green Deal is about, this massive policy movement, policy initiative that is multifaceted, has many aspects to it. and that was basically under development during the pandemic. Secondly, I will talk about how we are implementing our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. We're going now from target setting and announcement to the real deal. The third part of my presentation will deal with circular economy, our strategy in Europe, and the fourth and last on sustainable finance, which previous presenters have also touched upon slightly. So first of all, it's the outline. The EU Green Deal, what is it in a nutshell? Well, it's trying to establish an economy for Europe, but also trying to get consensus in the world towards that line. An economy that is climate neutral, that is circular and resource efficient, an economy that is competitive as well, because it is possible, as Howard was pointing out, and it's also fair socially. We like using, rather than building back better, we like using the building back greener. In fact, it's the same thing. The only way to improve the predicament of the planet and our civilization is to protect nature, because ultimately, as David Attenborough was saying in one very famous tweet, for every morsel of food and every breath of air that we take, we depend on nature. And nature has also become, or access to environmental services has been actually recognized, you probably heard last week, by the UN Human Rights Council as a human right. So it is becoming more and more important for the European Commission, for the European Union institutions, for the Europeans themselves, to protect nature as a basis to having an economy that is long-lasting and solid and resilient to pandemics or what have you. Let me go to the objectives of the European Green Deal. You have them on the screen. These are, of course, very general objectives. I'm going to go a bit more into detail afterwards. But the idea is to help ensure during this green transition towards, reducing climate emissions, protecting biodiversity, etc., take care of those communities that are less prepared for it, are less advanced. And this is the case, for example, of Eastern Europe, in our case, where there's a huge dependency on coal and where the transition will be more difficult than in other parts. There's also the objective of protecting human life, the important connection with health, the concept of one health I was referring to. We share one health with the planet, with nature. We cannot be healthy if nature is not healthy. There's the third objective is a clean and circular economy, an economy that is not extractivist, that is not based on extraction, use and dispose, throw away, but in a more circular.
Sorry, Manuel, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Your sound has gone off. I don't know if anyone else is having issues. The volume I just saw on my screen went all the way down to the bottom, and I see you still talking, but I can't hear you anymore.
Sorry about that.
I think maybe your volume just got turned all the way down.
Strange. Let me go to the.
I think I can actually hear. Yeah.
Yeah, I can also still hear you, Manuel.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, I could hear you.
Okay, well, everyone else is
just
saying that they can hear you, so I guess I don't know what happened on my end, but please continue. My apologies, and I'll try to troubleshoot what's happening on my computer. Sorry about that, Manuel.
Well, Justin, I want you to hear me, so so it's important that you noted that. We're having connection problems here this morning precisely. I don't know what's going on, but I've already noticed, so it wouldn't surprise me that. Just let me know. So I was going through the objectives. Also, there's the objective. I mentioned a number of them that you see in the list. Also, the idea is to help the European companies to become leaders in clean products and technologies. Here, the first mover advantage is going to be important as well. It's going to be a very competitive market. We're seeing it, the establishment of standards, etc. So it's also to work for business, because without the private sector influence and finance and efforts, we're never going to make it. It's not going to be, the transition is not going to be the job only of public authorities. And then finally, the idea of the European Green Deal is to lead by example, as we make our implementation of the nationally determined contributions is important, that we match our announcements with real actions. And I'll go through that later when I talk about implementing our NDC. So this is a very nice chart that we use to present the European Green Deal, many thematic and cross-cutting actions, but it's vast. I'm not going to go into it. The European Green Deal goes into not only setting up strategies in what we call communications of the European Commission, but also putting on the table legislative proposals that are then discussed by the member states of the European Union and the European Parliament. This is a very protracted process, very complex process. It covers all these aspects, as you see, from a zero pollution action plan that we have, circular economy, which I will expand upon a bit later, the European Climate Pact, which tries to trigger bottom-up action from organizations, civil society, from that to adaptation to climate change, which is important in certain regions of Europe. For example, the Mediterranean regions, very dry. From there to some cross-cutting activities like improving the research that we perform and expand the money that is available for this research in our flagship program, Horizon Europe and Horizon 2020 earlier. So it's a kind of overarching priority of the European Union, was launched in 2019 and it's been developed since. As we heard from other presenters, COVID changed little of the plans that we had. If anything, it made member states value more the solidarity implications that this Green Deal has, how everybody is going to benefit from these investments in a green economy. And another aspect that was highlighted and that moved things across the hard months of the pandemic was the realization by many scientific studies that air pollution, in particular in Europe, in very congested cities, I don't know, Paris, Brussels, air pollution made COVID worse, the infections worse, logically. The pulmonary conditions or breathing conditions of people were made worse with COVID. And if air pollution was added to this combo, then of course, the person was much more at risk. So the health connections, again, were very evident. And also was made very evident during confinement that urban spaces that are green, that are open to people, increase the value for society. It was very evident, I guess, also in the United States, that people needed some open spaces where the risk of contagion from COVID was low, but these spaces were there and sometimes they had been neglected. It's simple. It's just trees, urban biodiversity spaces, and spaces for people rather than for cars. So all these elements made actually easier to pass and to progress on these policy initiatives. So that's a bit of an overview of the European Green Deal launch as a kind of umbrella. I'm going to go now into climate action in particular, even though climate action itself is very horizontal. And here I want to stress the implementation. As I said before, how are we doing in terms of implementing our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement? First off, these scary charts that we see from the IPCC, and they are indeed scary. This chart I like very much. It comes from the IPCC report of 2019 on the differences between the impact of global warming at 1.5 degrees or at 2 degrees. Basically, the message you remember very well, this report, was that it is worth the effort to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, because at 2 degrees Celsius, we begin to play with the catastrophic impacts of climate change. Even then, you see in this chart a bit, what would be the impact in several ecosystems and systems, extreme weather events, corals, the Arctic region, of the different global warming milestones, if you wish. At 1.5, you can see there how already the coral die-off is massive. around 70%, between 70% and 90% of corals die is projected at 1.5 degrees. So our best efforts might keep perhaps 70% of warm water corals. At 2 degrees, corals are all wiped out. The key areas there that are much more sensitive to global warming are corals, the Arctic region, of course, we all know that. And by the way, the European Union has just published an Arctic communication yesterday, levels rise. But these risks are not academics, I believe, every year has repeatedly placed environmental degradation and climate change, these risks economic for every year for the world economy, several years in a row. When we lost, this is of course the economy, and again, I really repeat myself, excuse me for that, but the economy depends on a context, and the context is nature, a planet that is finite, and it has a number of resources that we're exploiting in a way that is not compatible with the long-term survival of our species. Let's put a price tag on the loss of corals. You know, some people think, well, corals are going to die. What's in it for me? Well, corals actually represent, in terms of value of goods and services around the world, $2.7 trillion per year. So this is the price tag. This is the price that we're paying when we say corals are going to die. This type of pricing is coming up more and more in policy discussions in Europe, and they are also triggering the action. I want to go now into the let's say the trajectory that we have followed for climate action in Europe. Well, the presentation of the European Green Deal, that was in 2019. Already in January 2020, before the pandemic, of course, we started presenting some communications, some legislative proposals on investment. The European Climate Law, which actually establishes the new NDC for Europe, the -55, the reduction by 55% at least of our emissions by 2030. This new target was actually adopted shortly before the pandemic hit. The climate neutrality target has been mentioned by 2050 was also, you know, Europe was kind of the first group of countries, the first continent certainly, that came up with that idea of having a long-term goal of zero net emissions. And during the pandemic, many other activities went on to try to go from this new, more ambitious targets of -55% reductions and 2050 net zero to the nitty-gritty. What does it mean? We had to tackle biodiversity, we had to tackle farming, agriculture, circular economy, etc., etc. You see a list, a very limited list there. It was much more than that, but that gives you an idea of the amount of departments in Europe, in our institutions, and the member states' institutions that got involved in this. On to the next slide. So this is the Fit for 55 legislation package. As I said, from the 55% reduction that we want to achieve by 2030, we are now going into the reality of the legislative proposals that we need, the binding regulation that we need, and the convincing and the negotiation that starts now, because the Commission, the European Commission, let's say the executive of the European Union, has presented already a very wide set of interconnected legislative proposals. You see them listed there, that go from pricing emissions to setting new targets in certain sectors to new, more stricter rules in other sectors. The combination of this package is to achieve, and this has been backed up by what we call impact assessments that cover environmental, social, and economic impacts of new legislation. This has been therefore studied, analyzed in advance, and the proposals now on the table, as you can see there, go from strengthening the carbon market of the EU, the well-known emission trading system, strengthen, deepen it, and also expand it to new sectors like road transport, maritime transport, and buildings. You have also in this, frenzy, I would say, of implementation of our target, we have a proposal on the table on land use and forestry and the contribution to particularly of forestry to absorb emission. We need to ensure that the capacity to absorb emissions of European forests is maintained and improved. This is one of the priorities. We have also proposals on the table on the way we share the burden of cutting emissions between member states in sectors that may not be covered by other legislation. So this covers things, let's say, that might fall outside of legislation. In those cases, the member states are still obliged to reduce emissions. There's the revision of the taxation on energy sources, ending up some exclusions from taxation for certain sectors, the revision of the renewable energy targets, the energy efficiency targets, increasing ambition there also, what we call the fuels package that includes more sustainable aviation and maritime transport fuels, the revision of the regulation that set up the infrastructure for the new fuels and for, of course, electric vehicles, CO2 emission standards for cars and vans that are more restrictive and that will lead, if these proposals are accepted, this will lead to all new cars and vans put on the market of the EU being zero emissions by 2035. There's also in this package a new regulation on a carbon border adjustment mechanism that covers a number of sectors that tend to be emission intensive, like cement, electricity generation, iron, steel, fertilizers, aluminum, for example. In all these sectors, the idea is to ensure that what comes into the EU market, what we import, is set to the same stringent emission reduction standards that we have in Europe. It's a measure that will come into place gradually, perfectly compatible with the WTO principles and rules, of course, and that we hope, and this is the final purpose of this measure, we hope we don't have to apply in a few years at all, because everybody else will have the standards of reduction of emissions in these carbon intensive industries as high as we do. Now, as part of the climate action of the EU, it's also important to look not only at the emission reductions, the panoply of instruments that we've seen, but also the other side, the adaptation to the impacts that are already here. We've seen these impacts, and Howard mentioned them in the States. I mean, forest fires, the dramatic flooding, the violence and the intensity of hurricanes and the storms. In Europe, you know very well what happened in July. It's massive floods in Belgium and Germany that took many local authorities by surprise and caused quite a few deaths and a lot of destruction. Major droughts in Southern Europe, boreal forests on fire in Sweden and Finland, something that was completely unthinkable some decades ago. So clearly, past emissions are already having an effect in the world. In Europe, we want to be prepared as we reduce emissions to be resilient to this impact. This new adaptation strategy was presented in February. I actually worked on that department at that time. And the vision is that by 2050, not only we in Europe are net zero, but also that we are prepared to face the impacts that will be confronted with at that time, and that are unavoidable because of the trends of emissions. Four main pillars here. smarter adaptation, so adaptation based on the latest science, more systemic adaptation, not only in specific sectors, but across administration and government levels, across sectors, and considering the change, the supply chains, the connections between the different operators, as I said, at all levels. An adaptation that is more urgent for certain parts, like water management, is a crucial priority, where we are seeing in Southern Europe that is also suffering water, is already suffering water scarcity. Are we going to continue assigning water to agriculture, to industry, to residential use as we did in the past? We need some rearrangement. What infrastructure is needed that will prevent the worst effects of drought? And then finally, stepping up international action for climate resilience. This means helping our partners, third countries, become more resilient to climate change. And in this sense, around half of the cooperation action by the EU is already devoted to help others adapt to climate change. I want to end this climate action, let's say, box, so I know time is running, just to pointing out that a cross-cutting theme in the adaptation strategy is the need to use nature-based solutions, the protection of ecosystems, to make sure that we are resilient against flooding, against extreme temperatures, hurricanes, you name it. And again, important to put a price on the money saved by adapting to climate change, as opposed to letting things go as they are. And when the hurricane hits, we're not prepared, and the massive suffering and the bills that it brings, we have to pay them in full. Nature-based solutions, for example, and one item that came across my readings, and it was very interesting, that in the coastal wetlands of the United States, as they are now, they provide $23 billion of storm protection annually. So storms are going to hit harder if the United States keeps these coastal wetlands. 23 billion are saved in damages. This is the type of figures to the benefits of nature, which are dispersed and perhaps not concentrated in such and such company. They need to start appearing in the charts, in our budgets, and in our economic planning. I'm going to move now to the circular economy, another of the pillars of the European Green Deal. I'm going to go very fast because I know I have a few minutes left. The logic of the circular economy is to try to reduce the impact in nature of the extraction and processing of materials. And this becomes very important when we think that 90% of the biodiversity loss that we are experiencing around the world depends on the way we are extracting resources and processing them. Another connection, this time with emissions, 50% of global emissions are dependent on resource extraction and resource processing. So tackling circular economy as a solution to climate change and to biodiversity is what moved us in the EU to adopt the Circular Economy Action Plan. The Circular Economy Action Plan has also become more and more timely now that we see the problems with delivery, with supply chains, with shortages of raw materials that we are experiencing. We are experiencing this in the EU, we are experiencing it also in the US, in many developed economies and developing economies. So trying to supply the economy with the value that is generated and that is already in the economy, it's a crucial element of the European Green Deal. I want to stress the three objectives of the Circular Economy Action Plan or strategy. The first one is focus on design. 80% of the environmental impacts of the objects that we have around us right now are determined at the stage of design. So it's extremely important to focus on that part. We have what we call in the EU the eco-design regulation. And this is one that we will try to expand in the future. The second objective of the Circular Economy Action Plan is to foster sustainable consumption, to bring in the right of consumers to have a repair of the objects, of the devices that break down, and also more transparency for consumers to make the right choices or for more circular products, for more climate-friendly, environmental-friendly products. Also, avoiding greenwashing comes under this heading. The third objective of the Circular Economy Action Plan is to ensure that the resources, as I said earlier, are kept in the economy for as long as possible, and that we look at the life cycle, the entire life cycle of products to do so. We look at industrial symbiosis, so using the waste, residual waste from one industry to feed another industry as secondary raw material, while keeping those secondary raw materials safe and keeping them as performant as they would be if they were imported as primary raw materials. So this is in a nutshell the objectives of the Circular Economy Action Plan. The plan itself actually contains 35 actions. I am not, of course, going to go through them. I'm just going to tell you that they are grouped in these 7 headings. I invite you to go. I can actually share the action plan to all of you if you are interested, because I see my time is running out and I still have a few slides to attend to. I would tend to actually end this section on circularity by stressing once again that the disruption of global supply chains, jobs, economic gains in these uncertain times are one of the objectives that the Circular Economy Action Plan wants to tackle. In our projection, we could increase the European GDP by 2030 by 0.5% by adopting more circular economy processes. There are currently 4 million jobs in Europe that are in the circular economy sector, if you want. We want to add by 2030 700,000 more, and this is perfectly feasible if we follow the principles of our strategy. Before I go from this section on circular economy, I want to give you an example of the innovation that is involved in these circular economy projects. I introduced to you in this picture Georges, Thibault, Theo, and Jan. These guys in Brittany, in France, have come up with a startup that is focused on recycling fishing nets that were discarded, landfilled, you name it. Well, these guys are using the fishing nets to produce a new secondary raw material called nylon that is now being used for apparel, clothes, and other many uses. What they're doing is now they've created a network of seaports around the coasts of France, and they're gathering the nets as a valuable resource for their business. And the European Union has contributed to their efforts in the beginning through the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. And this is a nice example also because it links, it ticks many boxes and shows the connection between an activity, fisheries, reduction of emissions by using less raw materials, primary raw materials, and the circular economy, of course, by using old, scrap material to actually put up a business and create jobs. The project and the company is called Feel a Fab. You have the website there. And it's worth having a look. The website is very graphic with very nice videos and an explanation of how they came about this idea. Many other ideas like this are waiting, are within grasp. The next steps of the Circular Economy Action Plan, I'm not going to go through this slide because I'm running out of time, but I can just highlight that a big batch of legislative proposals are coming in December 2021. Now, sustainable finance is the last very important theme, last but not least, that I wanted to discuss with you. I want to start with a bit of a picture of what the EU budget between 2021 and 2027 looks like. This is a very concentrated picture. What we're trying with this budget 2021-2027 is contribute to a green recovery in Europe and worldwide. Because the statistics now are not very good. The green recovery globally is now very, very weak. The OECD has calculated that only around 21% of the total sums that are being allocated to recovery around the world are actually green. That means that 79% of the spending in recovery is either not green at all or is actually going backwards and being brown and actually going into the wrong direction. The budget in Europe, which is for these years, 2021-2027, is 1.8 trillion euros, around $2.1 trillion. 30% of it will go to climate. So in all these sectors that you see, around 30% in each of them will need to be justified as contributing to our climate objectives. Sorry, I cannot stay much longer because I think I reached already my limit. I just want to take you to a last couple of slides to present the new sustainable finance strategy that we have adopted recently in July this year in the European Union. What are the objectives of this new finance strategy that is already in Google, it's already available if you want to have a look. The general objective is to align all possible sources of finance to the European Green Deal and the Paris Agreement. When we say all sources, we say public, private, national, multilateral funds. Everybody has to contribute. The specific objectives of the strategy are listed there. First of all, improve the integration of the environmental risks and climate risks in the operations of the financial world. Secondly, trigger the participation of the private sector on climate and biodiversity investments, which is at the moment very low globally and also in Europe. A meeting on 5th of October of the finance ministers of the EU concluded that the action here is extremely urgent if we want to achieve climate neutrality in Europe by 2050. The third specific objective is to deepen and expand efforts that are already underway in Europe. Basically three of them: the taxonomy of sustainable economic activities, a kind of classification of economic activities for investors to know which ones are actually contributing to sustainability and which ones are not. So this hopefully will channel investments and those investors that are willing to invest in the green economy to the right products and the right tools. Secondly, to deepen the disclosure efforts that we are promoting in Europe for companies. And here the concept of double materiality is important. What does it mean? We want, when putting forward this disclosure framework, we want companies, or we need companies to disclose not only the impact of climate change that they are suffering or the risks that they are incurring in their operations, but also how they intend to contribute in a way that is comparable, can be aggregated, can be assessed, and that is available, most important of all, to investors, retail investors, SMEs, any person that needs to do an investment needs to know whether the company is prepared to face climate change and is actually contributing to the Paris Agreement effort. I'm going to very quickly go to the last slide. These are 4 pillars of the strategy. I'm not going to dwell on that. There are many international aspects that are important, and this I want to stop a bit more because
excuse me, Manuel.
With the US. Yes.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think that there's a little bit of static in your microphone. I'm not sure. I think the sound got a little funky. Maybe it's just me, but I wanted to just let you know.
I didn't change anything. I think it's the system is telling me you need to finish, and I'm going to. Sorry, I'm going to. I promise that. I wanted to stop here though. Sorry if the noise, if there's some noise here. Perhaps I'm moving too much. I wanted to end with a couple of slides. The global ambition of the sustainable finance in Europe can be comprised in these elements. I think they are important. One, the international platform on sustainable finance that we have set up with other countries, Canada is in there, for example, and others. It was launched in 2019. Now it has 17 members, And now it's working this platform on the how to measure financially the synergies between finance the climate and finance for biodiversity. Second element, promoting consensus in sustainable finance forums. This is crucial. And third element, of course, very important, particularly for my job, is the EU-US cooperation. We had a summit, as you well know, Transatlantic Summit in June 2021. It went very well. We established a number of areas to work with, the Trade and Technology Council, high-level climate action group. But there was also, I want to recall, there was also in this summit statement, there was a paragraph talking, and I quote, of the intention to cooperate on sustainable finance, including by providing the private sector with usable tools and metrics. This is extremely important for Europe, it's extremely important for the US, and we are hoping to have more work on the OECD and G20 context soon. There's also, in our global ambition in Europe, is to support low and middle income countries for a green recovery. During COVID, the gap in financing for sustainable development goals in these countries has widened, has almost doubled. So this is something that we need to tackle. And finally, we are also active at the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. Right. Sorry, I took a bit long. 3 messages I want to leave you with that I've been declining a bit during my presentation. The first is that in Europe, with our new NDC, we're walking the talk on the decarbonization and adaptation. The second is the circular economy presents some interesting synergies with both emission reductions and the protection of biodiversity that need to be exploited. And the third idea is the finance, sustainable finance, must lead the way and must channel change, because nature is overwhelmed and cannot pay this price anymore. Thank you very much. Sorry, it went a bit long. Thanks.
Not a problem. Thank you so much, Manuel. That was fascinating stuff. I think we probably could have had you here all day just sharing what's going on the EU side on all of these topics. So with that, we can start the interactive